morning, everyone. I apologize, I cannot speak Korean, so fortunately there is simultaneous translation. Thank you to Northeast Asia History Foundation, Seoul National University, the Kungak Institute, for the high honor of being invited to deliver this speech this morning. It's a tremendous honor and a great occasion. I'm going to leave the stage, even though I'm short, because I like to try to connect with the audience. Maybe it won't work, but this is what we're going to try. So I apologize, but I had the 4 COVID shots, and also I have the breath spray. Yes. So let me begin with the war. The war ended badly. What I mean is the war ended well in the sense that the Japanese aggression was defeated. But it's the peace that was the problem. And even if you win the war, you can still lose the peace. It's not only winning the war, it's also winning the peace. The United States in Afghanistan won the war, but it lost the peace. In Vietnam, the United States lost the war, but in some ways it has won the peace because Vietnam has become somewhat of a pro-American country despite the American atrocities in Vietnam during the war. So you need to win the peace. This will be the main topic of my discussion with you today. Not just the war, but the peace. So as my wife likes to say, Asia is half the world, but all of time. And yet, when we discuss the Cold War, we are mostly preoccupied with Europe, when in fact, as this audience knows best, Asia must be a central part of our story. And in fact, Asia and European Cold War theaters are, of course, connected. The story you know well, the Iron Curtain, the tragic story, how Stalin took over half of Europe. It's a tragic story for the most part. But in fact, the Cold War story is not the tragic story. It is an uplifting story because there's a miracle in Western Europe and there's a miracle in East Asia, all during the Cold War. So in fact, the Cold War could be seen not as a tragic story, but as a triumphal story, or at least as something combining both the tragedy and the triumph. I'm going to try that today. I'm going to speak, my first point is I'm going to speak about what I call 4 partitions in East Asia. 4 partitions in East Asia: Korea, of course, Japan, Vietnam, and China. Korea at 38th parallel, Japan at the northern island chain connected to Hokkaido, which was renamed the Southern Kurils. Vietnam first at the 16th parallel and then at the 20th parallel, and China at Taiwan and Hong Kong. Partition. Of course, some of these partitions are still with us today. 4 partitions is my first point. This is an unusual way to describe this period, but I think it should be the common way that we describe this period. And as I show, I hope, in the rest of this talk today, they are interconnected. So let me get to point number 2, this Cold War or the post-war. No country was ready for the post-war. It's impossible to be ready when the war ends for the post-war. You can do the plans, you can make the memoranda, but when the fighting stops, there's a big vacuum. And everyone is rushing to fill the vacuum. This is natural. It's predictable, even if it's not preventable. And so people rightly say that post-war solutions were improvised. Improvised. For example, they say Stalin had no plan to conquer Eastern Europe. He improvised the plan, which is true. But you know, every time he improvised in the direction of freedom, of parliaments, of democracy, of rule of law. Actually, no. Every time he improvised in the direction of unfreedom, of coercion, of executions, of deportations. So it is a form of improvisation, but it is one that is based in fundamental values and institutions, unfortunately. So you cannot say only that everything is improvised. Improvised on the basis of what? What values, what institutions? Unfreedom. If you spend some time in the Communist Party archives of any country, it's quite frightening to see the moral squalor and the horrors committed in the name of the people. I've spent my entire life, longer than some of you I see have been on the planet, reading these documents. And they hold big lessons for us. So, no country was ready. Everybody was improvising, but Soviet Union was improvising only in one direction, the direction of unfreedom. And they were doing it very, very vigorously. Okay, point number 3. There was a lot of confusion because the wartime allies thought that they would keep the alliance. This was a crazy, delusional idea, but you can understand it. Who wants to continue war? The war is over. Great victory over Germany and Japan. Who wants a new war or a new conflict? They are all dreaming of a post-war of continued cooperation, but the interests diverge completely. And so there's this period of confusion when they are hoping for a better world without the conflict, but the interests diverge tremendously. Again, the focus is on Europe, especially Poland. Poland has no strategic value for the world order. Yes, that's true, unfortunately. It has tremendous value for the Poles, but Poland was a part of the Russian Empire, and Stalin was going to make sure that he controlled Poland again. So the decision was made already, 1944-45, about Poland. The big story was the China story. This is the story where the history was more open. China could go in multiple directions, and it was the most consequential for the world order. And it was the one that they paid less attention to compared to Europe and Poland. Again, for Poland, it's everything. It's existential. It's the existence of their country. I don't mean to diminish the importance of the post-war for the Poles. Nothing is more important. But for the world order, Poland has much less significance than China does, but the attention is on Poland and not so much on China. Okay. Point number 4. The Cold War was an achievement. It was a high-order achievement. I know this doesn't sound obvious or even true, but it is true. You see, the history of the Cold War is written as if it was a mistake, as if it was avoidable, as if somebody needs to be blamed for what happened, the Cold War. Blame Truman. If you're on the left, you blame American imperialism. If you're on the right, you blame Stalin. So blaming Truman, blaming Stalin, some people blame both, as if it's a misunderstanding. But it is a fundamental clash of interests and values. It's not a misunderstanding. They could talk more and it wouldn't help, because the interests, and even deeper than the interests, the values, are fundamentally opposed. And this, you must recognize this fundamental clash of interest and values and fight back against the values and interests of the other side. So Truman should get credit for the Cold War, not blame. And Stalin also gets credit because the Americans didn't want to fight the Cold War. They just wanted to go home. But Stalin made sure that the Americans engaged in the Cold War. Every time the Americans said no more, Stalin would do something. Coup in Czechoslovakia. We have the ambassador here. The coup in February 1948 in Czechoslovakia. It frightened the naive people who thought there would be cooperation in the post-war. The Berlin crisis. Of course, the Chinese Revolution. And the most important event, tragic event for consolidating America behind the Cold War was the North Korean invasion of South Korea. So Truman gets credit for recognizing the need to mobilize, and Stalin gets perverse credit because he kept pushing the Americans to mobilize in this Cold War. Let me drive the point home a little bit deeper about point number 4, the Cold War is an achievement. When two great powers clash, there are only 4 options. Great power competition, history knows only 4 options. I founded the Global History Initiative at Princeton University a long time ago, and I've been spending my whole life on this problem. The 4 options of great power, rivalry, tension, competition. Number 1 is hot war. Hot war, which is the worst option, of course. This is tens and tens of millions of dead. You know, World War II was at least 55 million dead. That's the lowest estimate. If we have a World War III, God forbid, it will be a multiple of 55 million for sure. So hot war is one option, and it's the worst option. The second option is appeasement. Appeasement is when you try to accommodate the interests of the adversary, and you discover that the more you accommodate, the more that they want. As we say, the appetite grows in the eating. And if you give, they want more. And if you give, they want more. So appeasement is appealing in some ways because you don't have a hot war, but then you are fooled because eventually you get the hot war in any case. It's just you get it on worse terms if you do appeasement. So I don't like hot war, and I don't like appeasement. Number 3 option is what we call Pygmalion. If you know from George Bernard Shaw, the play Pygmalion, where he finds the street urchin girl, the girl on the street, and he says, we make her into a lady. We transform her personality. This is known as transforming China into a responsible stakeholder in the international system. It is Pygmalion. It is when you as the outside power think that you are able to transform the culture and institutions of another great power from the outside. It is very seductive, Pygmalion, because we have the example of post-war Japan, post-war West Germany, post-war Korea, post-war Taiwan, and almost no more cases than that. So it's very seductive, the Pygmalion. And you just saw the United States try it with Russia and China in the post-Cold War. And it doesn't work. Because they don't want to be responsible stakeholders in the international system. They want to change the international system. They want their own international system. So you think you're doing Pygmalion, but what you're doing is you're strengthening them for their ability to overthrow your international system. So I don't like hot war. I don't like appeasement. I don't like Pygmalion. What's left? Cold War. Cold War is the 4th and best option in great power competition. That's true. I could give case after case. What's good about Cold War? It's not hot war. That's the main thing that's good about it. It allows for peaceful, predominantly peaceful, not exclusively peaceful, but predominantly peaceful relations between two great powers. There can be not just competition, but also cooperation, as there was in the scientific realm between the United States and the Soviet Union. Tremendous levels of cooperation. I remember I was alive. So, let me just finish this opening fourth point. It's paradoxical, but you only have 4 options in great power rivalry, and only one of them is a good option: Cold War. Again, it's not a mistake, it's not a misunderstanding, it's a fundamental conflict, institutions, and values. My fifth point, I only have 10. I wrote a 20,000-word paper, but you're getting only superficial version. I'm very good at superficial versions of papers. Like the rock, when it skips across the water and it makes a small ripple, but you don't see the under the water. The under the water is in the paper, and also in the Stalin Volume 3. The fifth point is just how fluid the situation was in 1945. In retrospect, everything looks clear, but in prospect, looking forward, not so clear. Very uncertain, but also very fluid. There were 2 gigantic factors that were not fluid that had to be mastered. One was communism, and the other was revolutionary nationalism. Communism and revolutionary nationalism. And in fact, their combination, their alignment, was the big problem for the post-1945 war. So it's fluid, it's open, it's not inevitable, but you have to manage the challenge of communism and the challenge of revolutionary nationalism. And very few people alive understood this. Only a tiny number of people understood that the post-war was about having answers to communism and to revolutionary nationalism, and especially their combination. Okay, so that's by way of introducing the problem. Now let's go more deeply into the cases. I start with the Korean case and the division at the 38th parallel. I look at this room and I say, there's nothing I can tell you that you don't know. You already know the whole story, where the 38th parallel idea came from, how the US officers were looking for the maps and only found the silly map from National Geographic, how the 38th parallel is not really a geographic line. It's kind of a crazy place to try to draw a boundary because of the rivers and the topography. So you know the story. I'm going to teach you nothing. You can be assured of that. You know that the Soviet troops were going in and the US troops were far away. That already on August 15th, the day that the Japanese surrendered, Stalin's Red Army was 50 miles down the coast of Korea and moving rapidly. And the US, this is August 15th, and the US has nobody on the peninsula till September 8th at the earliest. Okay, so this story you know. Maybe what needs to be reminded, however, is US troop concentrations, deployments, and capabilities. So the US troops were needed in the minds of the planners for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. And so having spare troops available for military occupation was not something that they could plan very easily, because no one thought the Japanese were going to surrender so quickly. And in fact, the US thought the surrender would come, as you know, in 1946 at the earliest. In addition, the US, once the Japanese surrendered, they were not confident that the Japanese would accept the surrender. The US was concerned about possible rebellion on the Japanese home islands against the surrender. So MacArthur planned to have a lot of troops to control the home islands even after the surrender. And it may look like the Americans had a lot of troops, but the requests for American troops were very, very high. General Wedemeyer, who was the top military advisor to Chiang Kai-shek, Japan surrendered, and he asked for 8 divisions for China, let alone for Japan or Korea. Also, America is an expeditionary army. America goes places. It's a sea power and an air power. The Soviet Union, the Red Army, is a land army. Land armies are what you need to occupy and hold territory. Expeditionary forces, they operate in the maritime realm, on the coastal lines. Again, they can go everywhere, but to sit internally in a country for a long period of time, that's not the best part of an expeditionary force. So America could get troops anywhere in the world quickly, but keeping them there for long periods of time was more complicated for the Americans than for the Soviet Union. Also, Stalin didn't have so much trouble if he wanted to keep the troops as long as he wanted. There was no public campaign to, quote, bring the boys home in the Soviet Union. In fact, there was no public campaign of any kind in the Soviet Union because, again, it's unfree. And so Stalin had the advantage of being able to use a land army for occupation and not worry about any pressure to bring them home. That's a form of planning, in a way, post-war planning, ironically. Okay, so you know all of this. Maybe we need to introduce the Austrian comparison for the Korean 38th parallel. Because Austria is also occupied. The Soviet Red Army is also in Austria. But they leave, and there's not a communist partition of one part of Austria. The Austrians themselves, before the occupation, form a political establishment, a political government. The Austrians announce a government of their own, a coalition government, and Stalin accepts the Austrian government. You know, of course, that the Koreans do the same thing. They have a government that they announce, an indigenous government, and Stalin does not accept the Korean government. By the way, the Americans don't like it much either. But why does Stalin accept the Austrian self-declared government and not impose a Soviet-style regime in Austria, but he doesn't do the same in Korea? The reason, my understanding of the reason, is that Stalin is concerned to hold Germany down. He doesn't want Germany to annex Austria again. He doesn't want a revived German power. So he wants a stable Austria. So he concedes to the acceptance of a non-communist government in Austria so that it's successful and it doesn't become an unstable plaything in the hands of a revived German power. So he goes against his usual behavior, and he accepts the Austrian centrist government, does not impose a communist government in Austria. In Korea, you see he has no control in Korea over the Japanese occupation. He has big control over German occupation, including in Berlin. But in Japan, he's blocked out by Truman and has no control. So Korea is the answer in some ways to the lack of control over Japan. He has a good stronghold over Germany in his mind, and he doesn't want Germany to include Austria again in a revival. In Japan, he's got no hold, so he will hold a piece of Korea as his insurance. Yeah. So the Austrian comparison tells you quite a bit. Now, there's an important paradox, though, again. The paradox is that Stalin could have invaded and taken the whole Korean peninsula. I know there are arguments in the literature about this, but if you look at the Soviet documentation, they were very persuaded that the whole peninsula was available for their conquest. And remember, if many Red Army soldiers die, it's okay. He goes to the collective farms where the peasantry is enslaved, and he gets more soldiers. And if he loses 1 million, he'll go get another 1 million, because he doesn't value life. And so we think, oh, it would be hard to take more territory. There might be resistance. Yes, there might be resistance, okay. And he will kill them if need be. Think about Stalin's mentality. You have Pyongyang, which is the Jerusalem of East Asia, 33% Christian population, and you have Seoul, which is the hotbed of communist underground resistance to Japanese rule. Why would he not take the communist underground city? Of course he would if he were Stalin. Why would he not take all the valuable property in the south? Of course he would take it. Why not? Who's going to stop him? The Americans don't have any troops on the peninsula till September 8th. By that time, he could bang his way down if necessary. And even when the Americans come, he can bang down farther till he meets up with them. But he doesn't. Why? So, again, a paradox. People say that it was Roosevelt's mistake to bring Stalin into Northeast Asia, because Roosevelt invited the Red Army into Japan. Well, okay, but did Stalin need the invitation? No. He needed no invitation. He was coming. He was coming. Yes. If Roosevelt didn't invite him, he was coming. And he was taking. So it's not the Roosevelt mistake. It is the Japanese aggression that has brought Stalin into Northeast Asia. Just like it's Hitler's aggression that has brought Stalin into Central Europe. So the reason Korea is divided is because of the Japanese aggression, not because of Roosevelt's mistake. But it's divided at the 38th parallel when it could have been much farther down, maybe the whole thing. Why? Because of the Kuril Islands. Yes. This brings me now to my next point. In Japan, there's a group of islands which are just north of Hokkaido. They are part of Hokkaido according to the 1854-55 treaty and maps signed by Russia and Japan. But they are redefined by Stalin as the Southern Kurils. This is Itofuro, Kunashiri, Shikotan, and Habomai. They're very small little island groups, but they're very important for sea access and for military calculations. And as I said, they are not part of the definition of the Kurils. And when Stalin first sends his military after the Kurils, they have orders only for the northern Kurils, not for Itofuro and below. And the Americans have forces close enough to take them. And the Americans ask Stalin for an air base on Itofuro. And Stalin says no. Stalin says no. And the Americans are shocked. They want the temporary landing rights, air landing rights on Itofuro. And Stalin says no. Just as Truman said no to Stalin about invasion of Hokkaido, Stalin says no to Truman about the air base. But the American military could have taken it. They could have held it. Instead, it became part of the Southern Kurils. And so Truman is negotiating with Stalin by telegram. No Hokkaido, air base in Itofuro, both denied, right? Deny Hokkaido to Stalin, deny Itofuro to the Americans. So the irony, the paradox, is that Truman wants the 38th parallel because he doesn't have the forces to hold a piece of Korea. And so he doesn't want to risk angering Stalin over 38th parallel, so he concedes the Kuril Islands to Stalin. So the Japanese aggression causes Stalin coming into Northeast Asia and bringing the Soviet Union to the 38th parallel, but the partition of Japan causes Korea to be able to hold South Korea to have everything below the 38th parallel. Otherwise, you don't have it. So this is a crazy paradox. On the one hand, the Japanese caused the trouble, and on the other hand, the Japanese rescue the situation. Because Truman does not want to lose the 38th parallel, which he cannot enforce militarily, so he's afraid to anger Stalin, he concedes on the Kurils. So the Japanese partition, the redefinition of the 4 islands, Itofuro, Kunashiri, Shikotan, Habomai, as southern Kurils, saves the 38th parallel for South Korea. And as a result, look what we have. One of the most successful societies ever in history. South Korea, rebuilding with the armistice after 1953, after the tragic war. So again, this paradox, the Japanese bring Stalin into communism into Northeast Asia, and the Japanese suffer in order for the Koreans to have the 38th parallel as the line. I know it's a crazy idea, but then again, look who I am. Okay. Now we go for Vietnam, 16th parallel. It's coming together. These are all interrelated, and you'll see there's a big picture here, even if it's a little bit superficial. How are we doing in the back? We okay? Still following? Everybody still awake? It's unusual. I'm speaking so long and everyone is still awake. Must be a good translation. Okay. All right. Vietnam. So here again, multiple paradoxes in Vietnam. You know General Order number 1, which is the order for surrender. To whom will the Japanese troops surrender? General Order number 1. And it's hurried. It's very hurried. Again, the Americans are not ready. The Japanese surrender, and the order, they're drafting it, and they only have a few days, and they don't know what they're doing, and they don't know the geography, and they don't have good maps, and it's crazy. But it's war, and now it's surrender. And so they decide, General Order number 1, that northern Indochina is part of the China theater of combat. The Chinese have troops on the border next to Indochina, Vietnam, and Chiang Kai-shek is commander of China theater. So the Japanese troops in northern Indochina, Vietnam, in the north, will surrender to the Chinese. And those in the southern part of Indochina will surrender to Southeast Asia Command, as it was called, which the commander is Mountbatten, so it's British. So the British are given the surrender in South Indochina, and the Chinese nationalist regime, the government of Chiang Kai-shek, is given the surrender in northern Indochina. Okay, it sounds reasonable, right? It's completely crazy. Why? This is why. So in the south, where the British, Mountbatten, takes surrender, the plan is to hand the territory back to the French. The British are going to bring the French colonial government back to South Vietnam, against the will of the Vietnamese people, but in cooperation with their French ally. And so they do this. The French don't have any troops yet. I mean, the French have lost the war. They're on the winning side only by the grace of the US and the UK. So The French don't have any troops, so who are the troops for the British to bring the French back? Yes, it's the Japanese troops, of course. So the Japanese troops, which have destroyed French rule in Indochina, are now the ones to help bring French rule back to Indochina, 1945-46. But it's not only the Japanese troops who are available for the neo-imperialism, it's also the British troops. But the British troops are all from India. All of the British troops that Mountbatten is commanding to retake Vietnam are from India. So in India, they fight and win their independence. And in Indochina, they help the British, alongside the Japanese, reimpose colonialism. At home, independence. Abroad, colonialism. Yes, it's amazing, but people say the British retook southern Indochina. But who are the British? They are from the Punjab, they are the Gorkhas, some Nepalese. It's an Indian army. Okay, so this is one paradox. Then you have the North. And who's in the North? But of course the Chinese, the nationalists, the Kuomintang in the North, taking the surrender. And who are they? It's a warlord. It's actually more than one, but it's a warlord regime. And they want to plunder Vietnam for themselves, so they don't want the French back. So the Chinese nationalist government, through the warlord in northern Indochina, prevent the French from coming in. And so who can take advantage of this? The Viet Minh, Ho Chi Minh. So because of the Chinese warlord, the communists get a foothold in North Korea. So in North Vietnam, thank you. It's just, I brought my wife for many reasons, but this one especially corrects me all the time. So think about this. At home, civil war, the Kuomintang against the communists. In Vietnam, helping Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh come to power against the French. History is so crazy, all of these paradoxes. So on the one hand, the Indian troops and the Japanese are helping the French imperialism back, and on the other side, it's the Chinese Kuomintang helping the Viet Minh and Ho Chi Minh take power. So you think, can't be, but it is. And Stalin plays no role, nothing, does nothing here. He won't even meet with Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh sends envoys, they make no progress, can get nowhere. Nobody can get to talk to Stalin to help them in the revolutionary struggle against the French. Who's helping? The Japanese Imperial Army, the Indians, and the Kuomintang are helping. Yes. And that's how you get division, first at 16th parallel, eventually at 20th parallel in Vietnam. But it starts with this crazy US General Order Number 1 to allow the Chinese to take the surrender in the north of Indochina and to allow the British, really the Indian forces under Mountbatten's command, to take southern Indochina. Okay. Now we come to China itself, the big one, Taiwan and Hong Kong. Am I okay with the time? Yeah. Okay. I told you it was going to be superficial, but I'm trying to cover everything, the 4 partitions. So there's this amazing story of the British returning to Hong Kong. So in General Order Number 1, Hong Kong is part of China Theater. So Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang are supposed to take the surrender in Hong Kong. This is the announcement of General Order Number 1. But the British decide that they're coming back. Nobody is inviting them back, but they're coming back. And so the British are far away. And Chiang Kai-shek is close by. He's a big army. He is a big enough army, no more than 300 miles away, could retake Hong Kong. But instead, and the British have a few boats that take 2 weeks to get to Hong Kong. But the British retake Hong Kong before Chiang Kai-shek does. Why is this important? Well, if you were going to be Deng Xiaoping and you needed an international financial center with rule of law and allocation of capital by market principles, Hong Kong would be pretty convenient for you. Hong Kong is one of the key factors in the Chinese economic miracle. But it's only available for Deng Xiaoping because the British, they ran in and took it back and reestablished colonial rule. So the British reestablishment of colonial rule in Hong Kong in 1945 is going to make Deng Xiaoping possible. Yeah, this is the craziness of history. Remember Shanghai. Shanghai is the great international financial center. Hong Kong is nothing. It's just a beautiful port. And it's the whole province above Hong Kong is just villages, rice paddies. It's a beautiful country, but there's nothing of later Hong Kong and Shenzhen that you can imagine. But because of the communist takeover in 1949, Shanghai is lost as an international financial center. And so Shanghai goes down and Hong Kong goes up. And Hong Kong takes the place of Shanghai in the international financial order and is more successful than anybody imagined, and is absolutely critical for the Chinese economic miracle. And it's possible only because the money coming from Taiwan and Japan, later South Korea, the foreign direct investment, is funneled through Hong Kong into the special economic zones on the basis of market criteria, profit and loss, not on the basis of communist patronage networks. Yeah. So can you imagine how big this is, 1945? These greedy British retaking Hong Kong, not understanding. Of course, in 97, they give it back. And then you see what the Chinese Communist Party has done to Hong Kong since they took it back. So you can imagine what it would have been like had they controlled it the whole time. Yeah. But anyway, let me talk, as I close, about the failed partition of most of China. The Hong Kong story is a great story, but I want to talk about communist takeover of China. So you see, Chiang Kai-shek didn't try for Hong Kong because he wanted to get to northern China first. He let Hong Kong go, thinking he'll get it back in a treaty later on. But first he has to prevent the takeover of Manchuria and northern China by the communists. So he asked the Americans, as you know, and the Americans help him, expeditionary force. They can move everybody and anybody long distances quickly. And they helped to move the Kuomintang armed forces up to northern China to land, and the Marines, and they try to prevent communist takeover in the north, which means they're going to lose the Hong Kong to the British, as I said, and gain the benefits unwittingly later on. But there's tremendous paradoxes here in the Hong Kong, in the northern China part of the story, and that's the following. If Chiang Kai-shek concedes northern China, he gets back Hong Kong, he gets a partitioned China, potentially. It's not clear exactly where the partition would be. You know, you have the Great Wall as a barrier, but it's not really a barrier, as we know from history. So where exactly there would have been a barrier between communist forces in the north versus Kuomintang in the south, and how stable it would have been, is unclear. But Chiang Kai-shek refuses to bargain over partition. He wants all of China back. And the result is he gets Taiwan. That's all of China for him, only Taiwan. So China is partitioned at Taiwan, but it could have been partitioned where, more like the Korean case, not exactly like 38th parallel in half, but more like the Korean case, there could have been a partition. But even more deeply than this, there was an option. You see the problem. Communism plus the revolutionary nationalism coming together. So who could solve this problem? Who could solve this problem? India could solve this problem. India has the partition, But they get the democratic version of nationalism with Gandhi. They don't get the revolutionary nationalism. The Communist Party in India changes the name from People's Democracy, that it's hoping to establish the goal, to National Democracy. And they become an opposition party in the parliament. It's the perfect solution. India can solve this. You need a version of nationalism that's not revolutionary and that is not aligned with communism. You failed to do this in Vietnam. You had a chance, but you failed. There was no way to prevent it in the Korean Peninsula, but at least you limited it at the 38th parallel. It never comes into Japan because the islands of partition in Japan, they are too small, no inhabitants, and there is no Japanese Communist Party in 1945, thanks to the repression. The severe repression of the imperial Japanese regime, there's no party to speak of. So the India case is a really amazing case that shows you what you needed to do. But there was even another solution for China, which was that Stalin should kill Mao. Yeah, that's right. You see, Stalin killed more communists than Hitler. Yes, he did, including more German communists than Hitler. Stalin killed, yes. So Stalin was not afraid to kill communists. He was giving Hitler some prisoners that Hitler was demanding. Leftist prisoners. Why not? Let Hitler kill them. Save the bullets. So Stalin could have decapitated the Chinese Communist Party in a deal. But the Americans have no imagination to figure this out. Stalin was set on a sphere of influence in northern China. He wanted a Soviet sphere of influence, Manchuria, Liaodong Peninsula. You know the story well. The railroad, the ports. What the Tsar had, same type of sphere of influence, only even deeper maybe. And so since he can take it anyway, why not make a deal for it? Why not say, okay, you can have it, but first you have to take all the Chinese communists back to the Soviet Union and put them on trial or put them in prison. You decapitate the leadership is enough with these movements. So the deal, you would have, if you were Roosevelt or Truman, you have to think like Stalin. I have to get rid of these communists. How can I do this? Stalin is my best friend to get rid of the communists. But no American is capable of thinking this, even though, to me, as a student of Stalin, it's obvious. So if you don't have the India solution, where the democratic nationalism is stronger than the revolutionary nationalism, where the democratic nationalism co-opts the revolutionary nationalism and makes it parliamentary party, if you don't have the India solution, then you're going to get partition, or you're going to need somebody to kill the communists for you. Yeah, that would have been my idea. Okay, I conclude now, winning the peace. I said I would come back to winning the peace. You see there are perverse and unintended consequences and paradoxes. You see the Japanese have brought their enemy, the Soviet Union and communism, into Northeast Asia. You see that the Kuril Islands have saved Korea, even though Korea is a victim of Japanese aggression. You see that the Indian troops are reimposing colonialism abroad when they're fighting against colonialism at home. You've seen the Chinese warlord wanting to steal what the French would come and take if they allowed them in. So the Chinese warlord prevents the French from coming back, so the Chinese warlord can steal, and this gives sanctuary to Ho Chi Minh. I could repeat all of the paradoxes, but you heard them already. So history is nothing but perverse and unintended consequences. Nobody is planning this post-war order. It's happening paradoxically and sometimes against the wishes, against the ideas of the people carrying it out. But there was an openness because if you could figure out how to do democratic indigenous nationalism, then you could solve your problem like in India. Or if you could figure out how to do a deal with Stalin to do the dirty work for you. So how did you win the peace? Well, you won the peace with Cold War, because Cold War is an achievement. It's not hot war. It's not appeasement leading to hot war. It's not the illusion of Pygmalionism. It's Cold War. It's fantastic. But the part about the Cold War that's not so fantastic is the revolutionary nationalist piece, because you couldn't figure that piece out as well. And so the result is that you have a failure to combat revolutionary nationalism, and you have proxy wars. The downside of Cold War is the proxy wars. So the great powers don't fight, but then Korea's in the middle. You get the war in Korea. You get the war in Vietnam. You get the wars in Afghanistan. You get the Congo. You get the proxy wars, because of your failure to manage revolutionary nationalism. Communism is hard to manage, yes. Revolutionary nationalism is a little bit more pliable, and this is something, in retrospect, is clear. How clear was it in prospect? Some people knew. You can read their memorandum, but very few people knew, and the expertise was lacking on the United States side, and the French had their own interests, and the British had their own interests, and it was going to be a complicated story. But if I had more time, I don't. If I had more time, we could talk about Philippines. We could talk about Indonesia. We know that their ambassador is here. We could talk about the cases, many hard cases, not linear, but where the revolutionary nationalism was co-opted into democratic nationalism. So the US was actually quite successful over time in many, many places, building a democratic version of nationalism, often through authoritarian tunnel, often with a lot of mistakes and victims, but ultimately that was the story of winning the peace. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Kotkin. We have time for 2 or 3 questions, if you don't mind, and I'll make it short. How fundamentally moved I was listening to your talk. Now, okay, raise your hand and limit it to like 30 seconds and one question with a question mark. Let's start with, briefly introduce yourself.
Hi, Professor Kotkin. My name is Jong-hee Park from Seoul National University. I'm studying international politics. Thanks for the very insightful lecture. I have a quick question about your take on the concept of sphere of influence at this period. So some people say you might need to rediscover the usefulness of the sphere of influence concept in this uncertain global order. Especially, somebody might say that 19th century, 20th century Cold War is all sphere of influence by great powers. And the beauty is great powers don't fight. And the downside is a small country suffer.
Yes.
And some people say we need to rediscover this concept in this, US-China and US-Russia and conflict. And what is your take on that? And how do you value the concept given your understanding of history?
Thank you. Sphere of influence comes in many flavors. There's an open, voluntary sphere of influence. That's called the American-led order. Everything that you know, which we call the international order, is an American sphere of influence at a certain level. It's voluntary. It's based on mutual obligations. It's written down in treaties. It makes other countries prosperous, not just the US, so it's not imperialism. It's an open, voluntary sphere of influence. There's another kind of sphere of influence which is not voluntary but coercive, like the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia, or the Soviet Union in North Korea, or, excuse me, but Chinese in Tibet, where you either coerce them to follow what you demand, or you even annex them. You take their territory. So this is what the proposition is. People are arguing. They're talking about sphere of influence, but it means one thing in the Chinese sense or the Russian sense, and it means a very different thing in the way that the Americans could have a sphere of influence. So I'm in favor of sphere of influence like the American one, that's voluntary and non-coercive. But I'm against the sphere of influence like the Soviet one, or today's Chinese one, or today's Russian one, because it's not only terrible for the neighbors, it's terrible for the people inside those countries. The biggest victims of Chinese communism are Chinese, not only their neighbors. And the Chinese speak about half-century of humiliation. They don't speak of the foreign humiliation. They don't speak about the century of humiliation, yes, which happened. They don't speak about the half-century of self-humiliation, where the Chinese killed more Chinese than any foreigner has ever killed. And so I'm against that. I don't think that that's a good solution because it's a false peace. You have to win the peace, not pretend to make a peace that's unstable and that can shift against you. Maybe one more?
Okay, the second question is from Professor Im Ji-hyun. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. I have a very superficial question. I'm good at superficial questions too.
For superficial lecture.
Yeah, okay. Just my question is very simple. I mean, did you see any Soviet documents to show that whether Stalin was interested in plundering in North Korea? Because as we know, Japanese imperialism, Japanese empire invested a lot to build a military complex and heavy industries in the northern part of Korean Peninsula.
Yes.
So we know that in Eastern Europe, Stalin, Red Army, they organized a special military unit who is specialized in the plundering economy. Even from Poland, they plundered.
Yes.
I'm not sure if it was effective or not.
Yes.
But so in the North Korean case, did you see any such a move to plunder this economy or certain residues of these heavy industries or military complex in North Korea?
It's a great question. Stalin will take everything he can.
Pardon?
Stalin will take everything he can take. If you have it, he will take it if he can. But, you know, think about his day. Think about Stalin's life. He's in the office, or he's at the dacha, and Berlin, Poland, Czechoslovakia, China, Japan, United States, domestic culture, domestic economy, ideology, party personnel. You know, so he's busy. He's so busy, he doesn't have time for everything that's coming across his desk. Now, if he's not able to steal everything from Germany and Manchuria, maybe he says, okay, you know, let's take everything from Korean Peninsula. But he's good so far. He's got the German equipment. He takes the Polish stuff because it's on the way. Yeah, it's just because it's in, you know, this, and he's going home with the German equipment, and there's the Polish stuff on the way home. So, if he had been able to have enough time and planning for everything, he would take everything. But it's too much, it's like an opportunity cost of his time. Too many things crossing his desk. And he's so happy with the Manchuria plunder and the German plunder, and he's also watching his own military officers so that they don't take it home themselves. He has to make sure that they take it and they bring it to his warehouses, not to their private apartments. So he's watching closely on the German and the Manchuria and doesn't have the kind of bandwidth, as we would call it, to plan for the same type of, but if the opportunism happens and some people taking it out and it's good for him, okay, he'll take what he can get. But he doesn't have the same level of detail in looking at Korean Peninsula that he has for China and for Germany. He just cannot have enough time to do it all together. He's in Iran. He's had to decide what to do about northern Iran. Should he stay because the oil is there? Should he annex? So he's just too busy to do the proper planning for Korean Peninsula that you would expect. If you see value, you think he would plan for it. But there's a lot of, as I said, improvisation and opportunism while the mind is focused on the German and the Chinese plundering. But this is the most important point for you to take home today, right? Communism is real. It's not something that the right invents to scare people. You go into the communist archives, and they are communists. They are killers in the name of greater humanity, in the name of abundance, in the name of freedom. And they are planning to execute people, to deport people. The documentation incriminating communism, written by communists, is endless. Even now, at my advanced age, I can't read it all. It's so much of it. So this is a real problem that we need an answer to. And the communists kill communists, as I said, and they kill leftists. And it gives me pain when I see the leftists advocating appeasement of communism, because if they lived under these regimes, the regimes would kill them or imprison them. And so this is a real problem, not invented, a fiction. It's not invented by the Americans. It's not McCarthyism. It's not a bogeyman. It was real. But managing that with the Cold War was successful, with the exception of the revolutionary nationalism that the Americans had much greater trouble figuring out what to do with that. The revolutionary nationalism piece, Ho Chi Minh, Mao, illusions that they were maybe just nationalists, not also communists, this big problem. This led to big tragedy in many countries, sadly. The downside of the success of the Cold War is also really big. Thank you for your time.
Professor Kotkin, if you don't mind taking just one more question.
I don't mind. I think they mind.
Professor Toyomi Asano from Waseda University.
Yeah.
No.
Me occasion. I was very impressed by your presentation. I had researched about the most farthest northern islands of Shimshu in the Kuril Islands.
Yes.
And United States Army tried to invade on the northern part of Kuril Island, but to tell the truth, Soviet Army came.
Yes.
And the United States had trained Soviet navies in Alaska. Dutch Harbor or the Aleutian Islands. And after the Aleutian Islands battle finished, they tried to invade to Shimshu Islands.
Yes.
In that way, I'm very interested in Kuril Islands, also Korean Peninsula. So I was very impressed by your linkage, by your showing linkage between Korean Peninsula and Kuril Islands. So it is very shocking news for all of us, because it's a very innovative and very, very easy to understand framework. So could you show me the concrete information of the document by which you confirmed this historical facts of linkage?
Yes. The irony of the answer is that we have had the documents for 2 decades now. It's just we don't make the connections. Because we study the problems individually, almost a little bit like silo. We have Korean studies. We have a Japanese studies. We have East Asian studies, is a little broader, but still, Stalin's desk, there is no such thing as Korean studies. There's no such thing as East Asian studies. Stalin's desk is the whole globe, everything. All the paperwork is connected for him. So this is what I discovered. I discovered just reading his paperwork. You know, every day, he's receiving 4, 5, sometimes 6 packets of documents by courier. The secret police, they bring to the the Kremlin when he's in the office, or they bring to the dacha, or they bring down south to Sochi. They bring the packet, and they sew the packet together. And 10 pages Japan, 10 pages US, 10 pages domestic movies, 10 pages ball bearings and weapons production. Everything is all sewn together for him. So if I study from his desk, I see all the linkages, even with the documents that everybody here knows. But we study Vietnam separate. We don't study the Vietnam story connected so much to Korean story or to the larger picture. Because of language limitations, because of time limitations. So it is not a great discovery that I make because I'm a genius. It's not a great discovery I make because there are all these new documents that we didn't see before. It is a discovery that I make sitting metaphorically at Stalin's desk and trying to understand the world that he is trying to understand, and seeing all of the connections the way he saw them. And to me, that's what I tried to convey today in the lecture.
Are the documents archived in your desk?
Thank you very much for the great keynote speech and engaging this